Welcome to Lesson 1.5, all about colonial government. In today's lesson, you'll need to know about the structure of colonial governments, the reasons why the War of Independence happened, a little bit about the Declaration of Independence, and then finally we'll talk about the Articles of Confederation. Here's your overview, and remember to take good notes. In the last video, we took a look at what influenced American colonial government, including the social contract theory. In terms of how they actually developed, most of the colonial governments shared certain things in common. First off, they had a similar legislative power. They were mostly unicameral, so they had one legislative assembly, and that usually controlled the taxes of the society. There were almost always property qualifications. You had to own property in order to be a member. Usually the executive or the enforcement power was given to an executive council or cabinet of officials plus a governor. This sometimes was called the upper house of the legislature, but we would call it an executive today. And finally, voting was really restricted in early colonial America. There were age restrictions, property restrictions, race, gender restrictions, such to the point that fewer than 10% of people were eligible to vote in colonies like Massachusetts or Virginia. That being said, more people were able to vote in the American colonies than anywhere else in the world at that time. Generally, we would explain maybe four reasons why the American colonies launched the War of Independence in the 1770s. Probably the most important were that the American colonies were angry about British taxes without their consent. The British had begun taxing after the 7 Years' War in the 1760s, or sometimes called the French and Indian War. They had begun taxing the colonies to pay for their upkeep, but the colonies didn't have any real role in approving these new taxes, and they felt like it violated the social contract. The British also were limiting colonial trade with other countries, which made goods relatively expensive, and there were limits on property ownership, particularly in the frontier, which made it difficult for Americans to move and obtain property. They felt like their rights to property were being violated. And then finally, there were some British intrusive policies in terms of searching for smuggled goods, and there were searching for smuggled weapons. Particularly in the 1770s, British soldiers began to be quartered in homes. And again, this feels like it violates the social contract. So going back to that idea of John Locke in terms of the social contract, they asked these questions of how could government enact taxes without consent or limits on property rights and trade rights and be so intrusive if it was staying true to the contract of protecting people's rights to life, liberty, and property. And if it wasn't doing those things, then John Locke and the founders believed that Americans had the right of revolution. Now, as we all know from American history, in 1775 fighting broke out in Massachusetts, and it spread to other parts of the country by really 1776 and 1777. The colonies declared formal independence in 1776 in a document written by Thomas Jefferson, and the Declaration is the social contract theory in action. It's a list of reasons why the British government has violated the social contract and why the colonies were entitled to declare their independence. The states, as they became independent states or independent countries, quickly realized that they needed to join together in some sort of fashion, and they formed a document called the Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was the name of the document. The government was called the Confederation of the United States. And there you have the three purposes of the Articles. The Confederation was specifically for the common defense and security of the colonies, which at the time considered themselves independent countries. Their goal wasn't a strong national government. In fact, they were trying to get away from a strong national government. So we'll take a look at here. The Articles of Confederation basically gave each of the individual states their own significant power and entrusted them a lot of power. Each state got one vote because they were all equal members of the Confederation. In order to pass anything, it basically required 9 of the 13 states to agree. Congress was given the power to do a few specific things. Mostly those things were to fight a war with England. So it had the power to declare war, make treaties, create a national army and a navy, and it could ask the states to supply money. But it couldn't enforce taxes, and it couldn't collect taxes. It couldn't enforce laws. It didn't have an executive branch, for example. It couldn't force soldiers into the national army. It just had to ask for them, and it certainly couldn't really regulate commerce. So it was really just designed as a framework for the states to get along. And we'll see in the next couple of lectures how that became a problem as the country developed. So hopefully you've taken good notes. Here's your objectives, and we'll see you next time.